Today, I'm interviewing Matt Johnson. Matt is the author of the book, How Hitchens Can Save the Left, Rediscovering Fearless Liberalism in an Age of Counter-Enlightenment. His writing has appeared in Quillette, The Bulwark, The Daily Beast, and many other places. Matt, thanks for coming on the show today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
So today I want to talk to you, I think, primarily around the theme of liberalism and the heterodox community. You and I have written for similar places, I think have a lot of similar perspectives on the liberalism issue, but we might conceivably part ways around the heterodox community, or we might not. I'm not too sure, but I think that this is a really interesting time in the, as you pointed, the counter-enlightenment versus liberalism. There is a weird tension that has cropped up over the last couple of years, and it's all these people who are kind of like in the liberalism movement, but they're reacting to hyper-progressivism. Something like this. I'm not sure exactly how even to articulate it, but this is what I want to get into today. First, I want to start out with kind of a basic question, which is, what are your thoughts on the current state of liberalism? And let me just add a little pin here that I believe that you've written about how you are still a fan of Francis Fukuyama and his theory of the end of history. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, liberalism is such a vast concept and set of beliefs and institutions that it's really hard to sort of diagnose it in any coherent way. But I mean, I think the state of liberalism is still strong. I mean, that's my Fukuyamianism, I suppose. Like you say, there are definitely a lot of counter-enlightenment, counter-liberal movements afoot at the moment. But I think the whole point of liberalism is that because it's so well equipped societies to handle pluralism and diversity, and all of the crises that we face. Like it is built to last. I mean, it's been around for hundreds of years. It's outlasted all of its competitors, if you want to consider it like a single ideology or a single cohesive thing. So I just think that its intrinsic strengths will continue to prevail going forward. But yeah, I mean, there's Trumpism, there's identity politics, there's powerful authoritarian challenges from China in particular, and all that stuff is certainly threatening, but I don't think it's terminal.
Culturally, back in the years of Christopher Hitchens' prime, the primary antagonist against liberalism was like Christian authoritarianism or something like that. I mean, culturally speaking, whereas today it does seem to be more of Christian nationalism plus this other element of the authoritarian left. Do you think that that's a fair assessment? And do you have any sort of a gauge on which is the bigger threat to liberalism?
It's sort of difficult to say. Like, I'm not sure if I would say the threat from the religious right or religious authoritarianism was necessarily more prominent back then. I mean, in some ways, like we're kind of going through a religious resurgence, and I write a lot about this concept of new theism, which is like it's a pushback against the secularization of Western liberal societies. And you got figures like Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland, and now Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and all these big characters, and some of whom I used to admire much more than I do now, I have to say. Like it seems like it's a mainstreaming of religious thought and in a way that we haven't encountered in the past. I wouldn't call that necessarily authoritarian, but it certainly does give religion a credibility boost among a lot of people who might not be inclined to believe in the Bible in the same way that like Jerry Falwell believed in the Bible. So it's like a more protean sort of political Christianity that seems to be spreading these days. So yeah, maybe there was more fear about like the 700 Club back in the day and like figures like Falwell, and now it's more diffuse. But in some ways, I don't know. I think it's a little bit more resilient now. But you'll find a lot of those characters who act like they subscribe to a much more progressive sort of liberal version of Christianity. They start sounding a whole lot like the Falwells of the world, and that worries me.
They do, yeah. I mean, Christianity is interesting because it is, I mean, like Richard Dawkins said, we are all kind of at some level culturally Christian, and we can kind of like be okay with that at some level, I think. It's just when things get wacky, and I'm even kind of sort of okay with people doing the Ayaan Hirsi Ali thing, where she needs some sort of religion to make it through hard times. That is a pretty common experience. I get that. Even, I mean, I grew up religious and I kind of maybe sort of remember that at some level. I think that there's a little bit of like a cope going on there. But it's just when like right now, the scary thing to me on the Christian side is when they want to overturn American politics with Christianity as their excuse. And it becomes very like Taliban-y, that project at some level.
Well,
And this is why I fundamentally do worry more about Christian nationalism than maybe progressivism, because I think that the end goal of Christian nationalism is so fundamentally coherent, and that it's just basically we just want to make it so that we're a Christian nation, full stop, and that starts applying to the law. The progressive movement, it's a little bit more wishy-washy what the goals are. Like no progressive that I know, and I know a lot of like hyper progressive people want to start actually taking away foundational doctrines of the Constitution necessarily. So yeah, I personally weigh the Christian nationalists still like as a scarier threat, but it is hard to say.
well, yeah, and you mentioned Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and I listened to her conversation with Dawkins, and she talked about like her personal reasons for believing in Christianity, or at least subscribing to it. I mean, the thing about it is though, she's not keeping it personal. Like, I mean, she's arguing that this is like the civilizational pillar that the West will collapse if it no longer has. And what I always have to ask people like Hirsi Ali is, what are you calling for? What do you want? I mean, do you just want to refill the pews? Is that your goal? I mean, in which case, okay, you can start a grassroots campaign to convince people of the divinity of Christ or of the power of the Christian message or whatever you want. Or are you saying, we should actually have some kind of like integralism, which, intellectuals like Patrick Deneen explicitly call for. And you'll see there's a lot more of that on the right nowadays than I think maybe there was in even the recent past. And it's becoming more respectable. And I think there's something about just calling yourself a Christian, especially if you're in this heterodox world, that almost seems transgressive. It seems like the cooler thing to
Yes.
do now, because secularism is so much more well subscribed, and because we went through the new atheist moment. And there was a period there where, you just kind of sounded like a caveman if you said you were a Christian, but now it's like it's kind of hip to be a Christian again. But yeah, I always wonder what these different political Christians are calling for. I mean, what do they actually want? How do they plan to get it? Those are questions that they actually struggle to answer, because I think in some cases the answer wouldn't be liberal, even though they
Yes.
want to sound like liberals.
No, very true. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is such a pivotal moment in this conversation, and I hate talking about her so much. She gets brought up a lot recently, but
I mean,
you're
she
totally
wrote that
right because
essay. It's huge. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
And it was so out of the blue too. And this is the thing, because she still has very liberal sounding rants against Islam. But there's that little like human element there, that you become what you fear or you become what you fight against. I mean, she could so quickly become that the Islamic version of a Christian. I could see that totally happening. I mean, because that's just like a common phenomenon.
I will just say quickly about Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I mean, I do admire her courage. I mean, this is a woman who's had to, she's had to live under threat of death for many years, and
Yeah.
she's had bodyguards, and this is like, and a lot of what she's done has been sort of in the Enlightenment tradition of criticizing religious authoritarianism, and I get that, and I've always admired her for that. But yeah, it's I mean, she recently wrote an article for Barry Wise's outfit, the Free Press, and it was just this weird conspiratorial rant about how Western societies have been subverted by Marxists and Islamists and all of these sinister forces. And she clearly thinks that like Christianity is the way we'll get out of this. We'll show people in the West that there's something to fight for and something to defend. And it's just like once it becomes political in that way, it seems
Mhm.
it seems really reactionary to me, and also in her case really quite conspiratorial. Like, do you really think that there are these bands of Marxist infiltrators who are like taking over the country from the inside, and she compares it to Soviet projects like disinformation and infiltration during the Cold War. And it's all just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. She doesn't actually cite much of anything either. She doesn't point to who these agents might be, who these Soviet style infiltrators might be. And there's just a lot of that going on, man. And it's like, and the reason I bring that up is like, it might be a good segue into some of our disagreements about like the heterodox space and how sinister some of these figures are. I mean, these people who a few years ago were like the intellectual dark web, and they were challenging identity politics and calling for free speech. Now I just feel like that whole movement is degenerating at such a rapid clip that it's going to like completely implode, like a dead star before too long. So yeah.
I did not read that essay by Ion in the Free Press, and now I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I think that would make me dislike her quite a bit. But
well, she doesn't mention.
Kind of sorry to hear that.
I mean, she's talking about the threats to liberal democracy. She's talking about subversion. She doesn't mention the fact that Donald Trump literally tried to overthrow an election. I think she might mention Trump at one point, just kind of in a roundabout way. And then her husband, Neil Ferguson, recently wrote a piece about how we're living in late Soviet America. And he notes all the similarities with the Soviet Union, but he doesn't mention the anti-democratic leader of one of the major parties who literally did try to overthrow an election. So it's like your politics are showing, they're obvious. You guys are just conservatives. You're just like, you're functionally Trumpists. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just like, that is the political purpose you are serving now. And I think it's quite ugly.
Yeah, this is where you and I are going to agree. I mean, because there is the elephant in the room, and it is Donald Trump, and he has zero liberal values at his core. He's an egomaniac, and he a would-be dictator, and it's just our institutions that are holding him back, and he happens to be the biggest enemy of our institutions, and happens to sick his fans on our institutions nonstop. So yeah, we're going to absolutely agree on all of that. I want to tiptoe into maybe the area where we might disagree. Again, surrounding the heterodox community, and like, to be perfectly honest, you might convince me of your side. So we'll see where we get here. But let me just throw a thought at you. I mean, we're coming at this from you came on my radar obviously because of your book by Christopher Hitchens. Let me just throw an idea out there that Christopher Hitchens came up and is who he is because of the age of television and magazines and basically mainstream media. Today, the parallel Christopher Hitchens is someone like Curtis Yarvin, who comes out of the blogosphere and equally eloquent in his own way, but represents things that would never be printed in Vanity Fair. And there's something about the internet age that just gives us these kind of like bizarro world Hitchenses, these intellectuals, but like the bizarro version of the traditional intellectuals. And all of them, for some reason, I mean, Curtis Yarvin is maybe the patron saint of this, want to subvert the system from the ground up, like completely subvert the system. I happen to like Curtis Yarvin. I think that he's very funny and very entertaining, and I like a lot of his ideas. But he wants to subvert the thing that liberals of Christopher Hitchens' day wanted to continue to build up and maybe fix around the edges, but like build. And now there's this tear down thing that all of these bizarro world intellectuals have as their project. What do you think of that thesis?
I mean, I think it's probably pretty accurate. Like, if you look at somebody like Brett Weinstein or a lot of the heterodox folks, like, it's not that they want to subvert liberal institutions or liberal societies or overturn them. It's that they think they've already been subverted and overturned. They look at Biden and they see a Manchurian candidate, somebody who cannot think for himself. And I have to admit, after the debate, my God, it was atrociously bad, admittedly. But like I kind of became obsessed with Weinstein a couple months ago, just because I watched his Carlson interviews, and then I watched a conversation he had with Jordan Peterson, and I was just kind of like getting sucked into the Weinstein rabbit hole, which is a truly crazy making place to be. And like, his theories have become so unbelievably unhinged at this point that I feel like it has to be audience capture to a certain extent. It has to be this like attraction to radical ideas for their own sake. I mean, I should just say for your listeners, like, some of these ideas would include the idea that the COVID vaccine has killed, something like 14 million people, 15 million people. He thinks that's a plausible estimate. he was at some conference, somebody put forward that estimate. He thought it was plausible. He thinks that there is a Chinese invasion taking place through our southern border. He traveled down to the Darien Gap and he saw some Chinese people, and so China's invading us from the south. You know? He cites the Sun Tzu, and he's just like, and he even speculates that the one child policy in China has somehow bred an army, and this army is now finally invading America. He thinks the WHO is involved in a totalitarian plot to destroy the Constitution and completely eliminate state sovereignty. These are just truly insane ideas. And I think you have to, if you want to carve out a niche for yourself, this is a good way to do it, is to be really insane and to do it in a way that's eloquent. I mean, the guy is eloquent. He sounds compelling. He's said reasonable things in the past about identity politics. The whole evergreen thing was a nightmare. You know, I mean, he shouldn't have been run off campus like he was. So yeah, you get people in the door with some reasonable sounding shit, and then you just bombard them with like propaganda, like month after month after year. And like that's, so I do think that there's like this overturning approach, like we're just like we have to overturn the apple cart. We have to fix this. This is such a crisis. Like we have China invading from the south, the WHO invading from every direction, you know. So anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question or gets at the point you were making, but I just think that this like tendency to be radicalized and then to meet your crazy audience where they are because they're already radical, like is this vicious circle that makes people pretty insane.
Okay, well let's linger on Brett Weinstein for just a second, because he is one person he doesn't neatly fit into any of my theories. I don't know. He doesn't fit in the he comes out of the blogosphere world of like the Curtis Yarvin types that I think is like the parallel world, Christopher Hitchens or whatever. He's an academic, so he's an institutionalist kind of fundamentally. If I had to just take a wild guess, I think that he just has a personality type that is drawn toward conspiracy theories, conspiracism. And he just happened to be in a position where he had a big microphone that reached a lot of people because of a particular circumstance in his life. And then the audience capture started to like happen in that context. I don't think it was all audience capture. I don't think it was all he lost his mind. I think that he always has probably been kind of conspiratorial. And I say this just because I know some people who are like this, where everything just becomes a conspiracy. They just happen to not have a microphone with millions of people listening, right? But if they did, they'd become ever more crazy. This is why I don't even necessarily consider him any sort of an important figurehead in what I consider the heterodox community. I just think he's kind of like nuts by the very nature of what his personality is fundamentally, because I don't think like RFK Jr., I don't think he can just like see something and not have conspiracy about it. There's like a mind brain personality thing happening there. I mean, I'm not going on much here on this, but like that's my thought.
It's just that the heterodox community is uniquely susceptible to this stuff. Like that's the thing. I mean, their whole point is like we see something that society doesn't see. We're viewing everything askance. Like we're on the outside looking in, you know. And I think it makes it much easier for crazy ideas like this to take hold. You know, I mean, Weinstein has perfectly cordial and respectful conversations with Peterson, where they talk about his theories about Chinese invasion and subversion from the South, you know, and Peterson sits there. And I mean, Peterson is a massive name. There's no way around it. He's actually super mainstream, you know. 12 Rules for Life was like the best selling nonfiction book in the world when it came out. You might have to, just to back up a little bit, and so I can maybe see where you're coming from, you might have to explain this Yarvin guy's theory a little bit better.
Oh, like, okay.
Is he's sort of in favor of, you say he's an anti-institutionalist? Is he like illiberal? I mean, what's he trying to create here?
Okay, so Curtis Yarvin is maybe the most fascinating person out there today as a commentator. I'm going on a limb here to say this, but he is just a blogger. He's got very I don't even know what world to put him in, to be perfectly honest. But kind of like the Silicon Valley world, I guess, is maybe where he kind of like inhabits. But he wants to overthrow democracy and turn us back into a monarchy. Except maybe he would actually kind of frame it as he wants to keep democracy but have a monarch at the top of it. Like he wants to have a CEO run the country, a very powerful CEO, and he has all these very convincing talking points about how, like, who was Steve Jobs? Who was he? He was a monarch.
Well, after the Supreme Court ruling, you know, I think he might get his wish.
True.
Right.
Who's Elon Musk? He's a monarch, and that's why he's able to do all these things. What if, guys, we just had a monarch that did like ran America like that? And it's great. Like it's kind of silly and it's kind of out there, but it's great. Like Curtis Garvin is so fun to listen to, but he also will like I don't even know because like he's one of these guys who will say something and then laugh and you don't know exactly how serious to take him when he says something super over the top. You just don't know. Whereas like a lot of the people you and I are familiar with will just be straight faced, like the Chinese are invading from the southern border. You know what I mean? Like that energy. He doesn't quite have that, which makes me actually enjoy him because you can always kind of like maybe Alex Jones. You can always kind of say maybe he's just in entertainment mode right now. I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, that's my summary of Curtis Garvin, perhaps.
No, that's useful to know. I mean, yeah, that's like it almost sounds more like performance art than like I mean, because if you're actually calling for a monarchy in the United States, I mean, I can suggest to you a few institutional constraints that might like get in your way, a few cultural issues that could confront you. So I always think if you're calling for something that's literally impossible, then I mean, the United States can have we have a very powerful president. I mean, that's one argument that I remember actually Christopher's brother Peter would argue that we kind of need a monarch in America because we treat the president with a level of reverence that the British do not treat the prime minister with. I wouldn't say this is true anymore. I mean, if you just look at how we talk about Trump and you look at how the Republicans talk about Biden, it doesn't seem like we're treating our presidents with much reverence. But the president is uniquely powerful, especially in the realm of like foreign policy. And we do kind of have this reverence for the office that I don't think other countries have for prime ministerships. Like there is something about the presidency that almost seems sort of regal, But anyway, yeah, that's a bit of an aside.
Yeah, all that actually is very interesting, and I'd love to explore more. I'm not quite read up on Curtis Garvin quite enough to go down that
rabbit
hole.
I'm certainly
maybe,
not. I mean,
maybe next time.
Yeah.
But let me see if we can get a definition for heterodox. Let me see if we can even agree on what we think the heterodox community is. I'm gonna let you go first, and then I'm going to. Okay, you know what? Let me throw in a note here first before you go. Do you listen to the Fifth Column?
I actually don't. Like it's so many people I follow listen to them and friends of mine do, and it's just not something I've ever.
Well, Michael Moynihan recently said on there that he's sick of the term heterodox because all the people who call themselves heterodox really just have mainstream normie views. There's something about that that's kind of totally true. Like if you're talking about Jonathan Haidt, he's a normie lib, and like he runs a heterodox whatever it is, conference every year. Academy. Yeah, that's right. Heterodox Academy. He's not heterodox. Like he is actually legitimately just a normie lib.
I think he would say that. I think he would acknowledge that.
He probably would too. But I think a lot of people call themselves heterodox just because they say that like women shouldn't or trans women shouldn't be in women's sports or whatever. So I'm heterodox. Like that's super literally radical. The most mainstream view like on the planet. Like, yeah, totally. Sorry guys. But yeah, I'll just throw that thought into the mix. But yeah, what do you think is to be heterodox?
I mean, the figures that I've been writing about are the figures from Wise's article about the intellectual dark web, like that whole crowd, Douglas Murray, Sam Harris, all those. I mean, I agree. The word heterodox is, I kind of use it shamefacedly because I'm really unsure what we're even talking about at this point. Because all the criticisms that I've been throwing at you, regarding somebody like Weinstein or somebody like Peterson or Ion Hirsieli, they don't apply to Sam Harris. But Sam Harris was certainly part of the whole heterodox sphere, but then he sort of disowned the intellectual dark web. And a lot of this stuff just sounds sort of idiotically rigid at this point, like these labels that people came up with. But I just think that they're like the Free Press, Barry Wise's publication, which is hugely popular and growing really, really fast. I would say that counts as heterodox. It counts as like alternative media. I mean, she spends a lot of her time ripping into the New York Times and other established media outlets. She publishes these views like Ion Hirsieli's ridiculous article and then Neil Ferguson's ridiculous follow-up article that are just like, it's not even that they're necessary. They're not Alex Jonesy. I mean, they're not just like huge falsehoods, But at the same time, they're pretty radical in the conclusions they're drawing. I mean, his idea of subversion, the idea that we're living in late Soviet America, And I actually have an article coming out pretty soon, taking Ferguson to task for that particular argument, because it's just, I mean, just comparing the country of Google and Apple and Nvidia and $30 trillion economy and all that to the Soviet Union. It's just stupid. I mean, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
At some point, you just kind of have to call a spade a spade. It's a dumb thing to say. It's a thing he knew would get him a lot of attention on Twitter, would make people angry, and it worked. It made me angry, And this is supposed to be a historian, and you really have to soft pedal. You really have to soft pedal the Kulak operation and Stalinist crimes and a lot of the things that the Soviet Union did to make this analogy stick. And I just find it really kind of contemptible. But I just think the space where you're like, oh, we're going to say something edgy, like that's about as good as I can do in terms of finding it, because I don't think there is or can be like a coherent definition for this group of people. They're all too different from one another. I mean, I could just start naming people that I would consider, like when I say heterodox, this is what I mean, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah. Okay. So I do agree with all that. That is very interesting. I'm going to go back to our conversation on Twitter that started all of this. And I actually thought about that probably too much, and I came to a theory on it. So let me see if I can relive. We just had like a 5-second Twitter disagreement. It wasn't even anything particularly Twitter worthy, but I'm gonna summarize this a little bit, because I think to me this is kind of interesting. So Eric Weinstein, good old Eric, had a tweet where he basically said that when the Republicans disagree with institutions, they just fight them head on, whereas Democrats, or let me say that again. When Republicans fight with experts, they just fight directly with the experts they oppose. I don't think he said institutions, but experts. Whereas with Democrats, whenever experts say something that's kind of crazy, they double down on it and gaslight everyone, because the experts have to be right. So even when the experts aren't right, Democrats will double down on it, rather than just being like, hey, you're wrong. Even though you're an expert, you're just wrong about this. And I think that there's something interesting about that. You responded to that saying that everyone that you're seeing in the heterodox space is just someone who used to consider themselves on the left, but then they're just kind of like moving right. My claim is more that I think that Eric is right, because I think that there is something about being a liberal person and seeing experts say something wrong, and then when you call them out, you are called a bad person by the left. And there's that like gaslighting element is so infuriating to a certain type of person, and I'm one of these types of people, that this is why I every now and then will consider myself heterodox, because I just cannot stand when the left does this to me. I'm still on the left. I'm like even like low-key progressive, but Biden is a perfect example. And that we are told by his campaign that he is perfectly sane, perfectly lucid. He just had a bad night. This is what Obama said, right? As like everyone in the country saw the train wreck of that night. And this is something that, even if that was just kind of like his worst of his worst moments, this is what happens when you're 81 years old. And that does not get better. That gets progressively or exponentially worse. And we can't pretend otherwise. To do so is to deny reality. And the left has so many of these just like denial of reality things. Everything from during COVID, it was you can't go to the beach, but you can, go to protest marches, et cetera. I mean, there's so many just like things like that. I have a list of them if you want, where the left just like makes it so that you have to deny reality to still be part of the cool kids on the left. And that is just madness making. I think that that's what Eric is saying. And I think that that is what resonates with me too. And I wanted to see if I could summarize that and see if it resonates with you at all, and what just your thoughts are on that.
I mean, the idea that happens on the left is reasonable enough. I mean, I certainly remember the George Floyd thing where, suddenly the people who were protesting the lockdowns in Michigan were called these freaks, for showing up there without masks, or even when they were masked, it's like, oh, you're in a big group and you can't do that. And then, the Floyd protests happen, and these public health professionals release this big open letter where they say like, no, because like racism is a public health risk too. So that outweighs the risk of spreading the disease. No, I totally get that. I will say, I mean, in terms of Biden's performance at the debate, there is no like vast Democratic conspiracy to hide this. I mean, the campaign hit it and hit it fairly effectively, considering how bad. But I mean, look at Claire McCaskill, who went on MSNBC right after the thing. She's as mainstream a Democrat as they come, and she said it was an absolute catastrophe. There are a lot of people on the left, a lot of Democrats who are, I mean, James Carville, and lots of people who are like gaming out how to replace Biden, and like there's mass panic. You're not seeing it among a lot of Democratic politicians for the obvious reason that Biden may well stay in the race, and you really don't want to be the Democratic House member who just came out and said the president is demented and we can't carry on like this. I mean, I write for the Bulwark really often, and that's like a center right magazine, but there are a lot of lefties who write for it, and a lot of just like mainstream Democrats who read it. The Bulwark has been like relentless on how horrible that performance was, and how it's really time for Biden to consider stepping down. And so anyway, that's just I just don't think that the mainstream left is trying to gaslight anybody about Biden's health. I mean, there are people doing it. I mean, Obama's tweet was silly. I totally agree with you. But I just think it's too dynamic, and there are too many voices like being honest about it. And it's been a concern for a long time. I mean, Democrats themselves, when they're polled about Biden's mental agility, like they're not under any illusions. Like, this guy is pretty far around the bend. I think so. It's probably true that something like climate change does create a lot of dogma, and it's unjustified, because if you look at the research on what people actually know about things like the theory of evolution or about climate change, it's not much. Like if I was actually asked to explain the mechanics of global warming in some rigorous way, I would not do so very effectively, but I'm somebody who kind of trusts the science on the issue. And if you have an opinion that says, even if it's not like you're not a global warming denier, if you're just somebody who says maybe it isn't that severe, it's very likely that you can get you'll get bombarded with hate, and maybe you get in trouble if you're an academic without tenure. And so maybe there isn't a tendency on the left to do that, although I just feel like the right has its own bugaboos and its own dogmas as well, and that's, it just doesn't seem to me like there's this really huge imbalance that Weinstein is seeing. And I was reacting to everything he listed, and then if you just go to his timeline and look at the things he focuses on, it's always about how Biden is like completely mentally ill fit. It's always about like the travesty of our immigration policy. It's always like every view that he holds is either explicitly or implicitly right wing. I mean, or what he chooses to focus on. And this is a guy who will say, I'm a liberal, And I remember when Brett Weinstein used to say, oh, I was a Sanders supporter, as if that like means he's progressive and on the left and liberal until the end of time because he supported Sanders. Or like, I'm an Occupy Wall Street supporter. Who even remembers what Occupy Wall Street was? Like, who cares at this point? So I think that their general approach is always something that the right can embrace. Like, does Brett think it's a coincidence that Tucker Carlson is his new best friend? Does he think it's a coincidence that he ended up on Fox News over and over and over again to discuss Evergreen? This is exactly what happened to Dave Rubin, where he was talking about like threats to free speech on the left. So Fox loved him. And then he just became a flame-throwing nut job conservative, like in short order. I mean, Rubin is like, Weinstein is 1,000 times closer to the center than Dave Rubin. I mean, who's just a right-wing operative now. But I just think that like all of these figures tend in that direction, the vast majority of them. Harris is a very notable and I think honorable exception. I actually think he doesn't get the credit he deserves for resisting those political wins, because a lot of his audience hates when he talks about Trump. He's definitely lost a lot of support because of it. He's definitely lost money because of it, and he's just like held really firm on that subject. And it's difficult to detect a view he holds that has shifted markedly because of what seems to be audience pressure. I just don't think there's any evidence of that happening. But he is just like such an outlier.
I think that Sam Harris does this correctly, where he threads that needle, because he will call out the gaslighting of the left, but then he also kind of in the back of his mind understands that institutions self-correct over time, just not immediately, but over time they will kind of correct. And his view of the world ends up being closer aligned to reality, because like you said, with a lot, well, let's say a lot of the COVID stuff, it was crazy making at first. And then Gavin Newsom even has said things like, we did close the schools for too long. We were kind of wrong about that. We were acting out of fear.
Like that acknowledgement should matter, at least. I mean, it's true that at the time, but like, at the time we were in a once in a century pandemic, people were very scared. There was a lot of political pressure to like take action. I remember I was actually visiting a friend in Los Angeles when they closed the beaches. I was like, this is like the last thing you want to do. Like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
Go to the gym instead? Like, this is just idiotic. Or like, people who would mask when they were hiking, wide open spaces.
So someone like Joe Rogan, let's say, would hold on to that fact that California closes schools for too long, and then he will obsess over it. It becomes a talking point, and he never lets it go, and it just becomes a data point in the left is crazy, full stop. The left lost their mind, full stop. And I would just say, like, the Sam Harris move is to, yes, the left lost their mind for a particular point in time, and then it corrected, and a lot of the powerful figures came out and said that they were wrong, exactly, completely, 100% as it should have happened. So
there's a lot of course correction going on. I think there's a lot of soul searching. I mean, even on like something like the lab leak, it's way more respectable now to say the lab leak is a possibility than it used to be. And I do you ever listen to the podcast Decoding the Gurus? Those guys.
I do actually listen to your episode on there, and I do listen to them every now and then.
Yeah,
they're a little bit.
They're good. I really like the show. On the lab leak thing, like they're really critical of anybody who could even entertain the lab leak. Like they think like there's a really heavy preponderance of evidence against it. And I think this is because a lot of people who said lab leak like turned out to be more right than we knew early on. So they've run so many victory laps at such an
they're
intense
so
pace.
Ideological on this one topic, the lab leak. Yeah, it's weird to me how ideological they are. It's
just
very
frustrating to watch. Like it's frustrating to watch somebody like Weinstein take victory laps when we still don't know. And like I listened to their really long the Decoding the Gurus. They had a really long conversation with these virologists, and like I thought it was pretty compelling, making a case for the natural origin. But again, this is such a deep and nuanced issue that like Jamie Palmer, my editor at Quillette, wrote an article about why he thinks the lab leak is like not a particularly compelling theory. It's really good in Quillette. So yeah, I've like read all this stuff and consumed a lot of information, but it's like not something I'm even remotely interested in writing about or like weighing in on. I do just think it's a little bizarre that it's become such an insane political football. Like it seems possible that it could be the lab leak. It seems likelier that it's the natural origin. It's just like this obsession.
I'm back to leaning towards the lab leak. The New York Times had that article about that had all these like graphs and charts, and it was just got like the visualness of it was like, oh shit, okay, this is so like the coincidences start piling up, and I'm like, I don't even care. The coincidences are crazy. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, if I hear otherwise, I'm so down to change my mind as long as I know. Like I
also,
know.
So also the one thing I will say about Harris is I actually feel like as much as I align with him on the general principles that underlie his view on identity politics, I think I'm less radical than him, just because he seems to think like he'll often talk about woke capture of institutions, and he'll talk about how like the New York Times is just so riven with woke pathologies that it barely functions anymore. I just like don't see it. I just don't see that. I read the New York Times all the time. They've got John McWhorter there writing for him. They've got Ross Douthat. They've got like all these people who absolutely don't like align with the crazy woke worldview. And then their hard reporting seems to me really generally excellent. Like, I mean, especially their international affairs reporting. Like the New York Times is still a great outlet. And it seems odd to me to run it down endlessly because it's obviously it's made mistakes, and it's run really. I remember when it ran an article by Roxane Gay that I thought was just like beyond the pale ridiculous, where if you ever call the police on a black person, then you're essentially ordering a hit on that person. Like she said something like that in the piece. I was like, okay, well that's just crazy, but it's just like, yeah, even Harris, as much as I admire him and as right as I think he is about some of these things, like he takes it to an extreme I wouldn't take it to. Like I don't see woke capture everywhere I look. I mean, are you more aligned with him on that? Like, do you think it's like a deeper rot?
I think that I have very little background in journalism, although it kind of sort of it like in a Silicon Valley way. But I think it depends on the editor there. I think that there are some editors who are ideologically captured, but I read the New York Times every single day, and their best work is always the stuff that's like just actual reporting, and you don't get that anywhere else. There was a fascinating story this week about a guy in Kathmandu or something like this who was thought that he was signing up to go be a security guard in Russia, but instead he paid $5,000 to go to the front lines in Ukraine, and somehow he escaped and I fled back to Kathmandu or something like this is an amazing story. It is like an action movie with Tom Cruise. Like, it was so good and like riveting. That's amazing. Like, and you're not going to get that anywhere else. I mean, I'm sure there are some other great outlets out there, but like the New York Times is so good for so many things that it is totally unfair to throw them under the bus because they publish some beyond the pale stuff every now and then.
Like wacky stuff in the opinion. I mean, I was an opinion page editor for a while at this paper in Kansas for almost 2 years. And it really drove me crazy when people would call the whole paper out and they'd call the reporting staff out for some editorial that I wrote or for some column that I wrote, which my name was on. I'm like, guys, this has nothing to do with the newsroom. It's a completely separate enterprise. Like, you always have to enforce that distinction. You know, I mean, yeah, some of the New York Times' coverage of Ukraine has been like unbelievably good. They had an article recently about like radicals in the Israeli government and just how like tolerant people are, especially like in the settlement areas, like of crimes that are committed against Palestinians, and like it was unbelievably well reported and extensive, you know, and there's so much of that it's just. Yeah, I have to wonder when somebody says like, oh, the institution's been completely captured, or when Barry Wise says, oh, the gray lady's just fallen. Like, what really? I mean, I could name 1,000 articles that disprove that. Like, and they send people to the Darien Gap and cover the migration. You know, I remember when Weinstein and Tucker were saying like, oh, you won't see New York Times reporters down there, and I was like, I just listened to it on the daily. Like, they've already sent people there. Like, you guys are insufferable.
Oh, that's great. That's funny.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of an institutionalist. Like, at the end of the day, I feel like this establishment figure, you know, or somebody who's like too inclined to sort of align with the establishment. That's just because I think like institutions become established for a reason. Like, newspapers like the New York Times have large legal departments. They can't just lie about people. If they do that, they'll get sued.
Exactly.
They'll lose a lot of money. Like, I mean, a lot of these bloggers don't have that. Brett Weinstein doesn't have to worry about it. Who's going to sue Brett Weinstein? Who gives a shit?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, people underestimate how bad the blogosphere is. They completely disregard how bad it is. Yeah, totally. I want to ask you a couple of questions about Christopher Hitchens before we go, just because you are the resident expert on him. My first
what
question.
What a weird thing to be an expert on.
Well, I mean, like I'm going to just recommend your book to folks because we're not going to have much time to talk about it really. And you've actually done a lot of great interviews. I was preparing for this. I listened to your interview with Dakota and the Gurus and Michael Shermer. I know you were on a lot of other shows. So yeah, there's a lot out there. We don't definitely have to tread on that. But I just want to get your thoughts on a couple of fun topics related to him. My first topic is first question is, do you think that or maybe I'll put it this way. What type of influence can a writer actually expect to have these days? Going back to Sam Harris, he just had George Saunders on last week, one of my favorite writers. And Sam Harris said that he had never heard of George Saunders before, and he's never even to this day read his fiction. He just read a couple of his essays and thought that they were very good. George Saunders is huge. He is a giant. Like, he's as big as you can possibly get in the literary scene. You know, he is kind of essentially in that realm of Christopher Hitchens, just but in like fiction. Do you think that we can't actually have heroes in the writing space anymore, like bigger than life figures who just write for a living, or is that just a done thing? Are we done having Christopher Hitchenses that have the cultural influence that he had? We also had Andrew Sullivan. His star kind of like, you know, it's definitely his best work is in his past, just because he led the gay rights movement. You can't lead another movement like that as a writer, right? Or can you? Like, can you be just a writer like Hitchens or like Sullivan and lead a movement, or just like be a superstar on TV? Is that a thing anymore, or is that actually just done?
I don't know. I think about it often. I mean, especially in Hitchens's case, because you know, there's so many things that date Hitchens. I mean, the new atheism thing is now viewed as this sort of trope. I mean, it's like, and I still think the new atheists were right about a lot of things. I thought they were kind of an important movement, you know. And I haven't just like adopted this kill your heroes mentality where like all the people who influenced me when I was a freshman in college are just suddenly like without merit or value. Like, this is something that people tend to do. Like, there's, oh, back in the day I used to. No, I mean, they made good arguments, you know, but and you can look at like the secularization in the West and be like, oh yeah, they kind of helped to fuel that, but they were probably tapping into something that was already happening, but like a lot of people have told me that the chapter on Iraq in my book is kind of an exhausting read, just because it's an issue that just doesn't feel front and center anymore. I mean, even for people who shared Hitchens's view, or people who might be sympathetic toward a more interventionist foreign policy, like it just seemed long and it seemed sort of outdated. I mean, Hitchens's concerns, even about like Islamofascism. I mean, we're living through an era, like we lived through the Bataclan massacre in Paris, like we lived through Charlie Hebdo. Like it's certainly true that Islamic extremism will continue to haunt us, and it will continue to be like a major problem in the world. But is it a civilizational problem? Does it pose the same threat that like a rising nationalist, aggressive China poses? I mean, I would say absolutely not. And that's one of those issues that Hitchens he really thought this was the next great civilizational struggle, and he made it. But now that seems dated. I mean, that seems like we have bigger issues to focus on. And so even as brilliant as he was, and as much as I admired his work and as big of an influence as he had on me, like so many of those core positions that he spent so many years arguing for have kind of become marginal in a way. So even when you were big, I mean, Hitchens was getting paid 10 grand a pop to speak places. He was selling hundreds of thousands of books. He's a brilliant stylist, like unmatched stylist, really, in many ways. You're always a product of your time, and like it's very rare that an Orwell comes around. I mean, somebody who really does seem timeless. I mean, I just reread 1984 while I was on my honeymoon for some reason, and it was just as brilliant as it was when I read it 10 years prior, and it will be just as brilliant when I read it again 10 years from now. And it's just like because I am really a huge Orwell stan. Like I can see why he had such an influence on Hitchens, although stylistically they're so different. But anyway, that's just so rare. Like I don't think we have many epochal writers these days, and so many intellectuals now are just a flash in the pan. I mean, a Weinstein is just going to come and go. Yep. 99.9% of people, like if you ever feel marginal, like just recognize that in the grand scheme of things, like pretty much every single person, even people with hundreds of thousands of Substack followers and massive Twitter followings, they're marginal too. I mean, no one's going to be consulting the brilliant writings of Brett Weinstein and 30, 40 years time. Like, I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen.
So a lot of this, I think, is because of technology and culture shifts. And I'm fascinated by the topic of how technology determines culture. And I always say that, like, if Shakespeare were alive today, he would not be writing plays. He'd be in Hollywood writing screenplays. And that might already be coming to kind of like phasing out. And maybe there would be something else that he'd be doing, that someone with that literary of a mind. What would someone with the rhetorical wit of Hitchens's mind be doing? Would he be a podcaster today, or would he still be like trying to write for Vanity Fair?
It's funny. I actually had a disagreement with an editor a little while back. He's also a really big Hitchens fan. I sort of find it hard to imagine Hitchens starting a Substack. And this guy was like, oh, why? I mean, Hitchens, he was always willing to make a buck where he could. And like he would have been huge on Substack. I mean, he would have had a massive built-in following. It seems like a perfect, and also just like his ability to pump out copy with very little editing, and like he would just be such a success on there. And I was like, yeah, that's possibly true, but there is something about Hitchens that seems so traditional. Like apparently he says he used like a typewriter until the last local ribbon store shut down in DC. So he couldn't like get the ink ribbons that he needed. And he would always like boast about how he couldn't use his cell phone for anything beyond making calls. I think he thought that there was a romance to being the sort of like walking anachronism, Yeah. And Hitchens does seem so vintage in so many ways. Like he's this bohemian figure in an age of like self-help and like really relentless like self-improvement. And I think the idea of him like being a self-starter who like creates his own Substack, this is Christopher Hitchens. Like I feel like he just keep publishing and all the outlets that he's been publishing for and keep writing books. Like I don't know, it was hard to imagine for me. But yeah, he would obviously be brilliant on podcasts. I mean, it's just like doing a radio interview or a TV interview. There would be countless outlets for him. So yeah, he'd just keep doing all that stuff. But yeah, I don't know if he would have started his own free press. I find it unlikely.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. Yeah, at some level, you do have to kind of sort of adapt to the times, but there's a brilliance to that romance and to holding on to that. I mean, I think a lot of writers have that at some level, and it adds, it doesn't detract, I think. Last question here. I'm just kind of curious because you do get asked about these sorts of things all the time. Do you think that there's any value to asking, like, what would Hitchens think about, the Gaza war or Ukraine? Is there value to that, or is it just people, I don't know, like pretending, like just pretending?
Yeah, no, I definitely think there's value in it. It's a fun game to play. Hitchens used to talk about how you couldn't actually play the game honestly after a certain amount of time had passed. So he would never like claim that Orwell would have been a supporter of the Iraq War or something. But Hitchens always said he thought that Orwell would have been opposed to the Vietnam War, just based on his attitudes toward imperialism and no China and that sort of thing.
Okay, so this is interesting. Let me jump in with a follow-up here. It was that when your mind plays this game, then, of what would Hitchens think about, what are the principles in particular that you reach for, like free speech absolutism, or what's in there? What is your mind actually pulling for when you think, what would Hitchens think of this?
Yeah, I just try to hew as closely as possible to his actual written work. Like, I just think you just have to minimize conjecture to the extent possible. I mean, I think it's very likely that he would have been much more heterodox, to use the word once again, on Gaza. I just think there are
Oh, interesting.
a lot of people think of Douglas Murray as like a modern day Christopher Hitchens. He's just not at all.
No, I don't
He's
think so either.
anti-Europeanist. He's never been on the
Yeah.
left. He has no sympathy for the left whatsoever. He's just a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. Hitchens would be much more critical of the Netanyahu government than people probably realize. He would be much more critical of the war in Gaza. I mean, I think I can say that with almost 100% certainty. I mean, Hitchens was an anti-Zionist. He didn't even, and this is something that can get you labeled.
So was Sam Harris back in the day. People
Yeah.
changed their minds on that.
No, I
Interesting.
mean, it just depends on what you mean by the thing. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
like, obviously he didn't think that the state of Israel should no longer be constituted. Like, he thought if Hitchens could go back in time and agitate for a position, he would have agitated against the establishment of the state of Israel.
Yeah.
So that's
That
a
sounds
view that
great.
he just
Yeah.
made abundantly clear. So yeah, I mean, on Gaza, I think he would be surprisingly pro-Palestinian, to be obnoxious. I mean, obviously he's also, as someone who wrote God is Not Great and was deeply critical of Islamic anti-Semitism and groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the mullahs in Iran, like, yeah, he would have taken an extremely hard line on Hamas, and he would have been revolted by the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, I really don't want to like downplay that particular element of his worldview. But at the same time, I just think maybe it would be a more nuanced position than people expect. He would have a lot of moral clarity. I mean, anyone waving a Hamas flag on a college campus would earn his just unerring contempt until the end of time, for sure. So that's one issue. I actually, my biggest risk that I took in the book was that I thought he would have actually diagnosed Trumpism fairly early on, and I thought he would probably recognize that right-wing authoritarianism is a huge threat in the world. And this, I mean, I really have no right to say I know what he would, because he also hated Hillary Clinton. Trump ran against Clinton. Some of these things are a little difficult to predict, and certainly none of his friends would have predicted that he would have supported the Iraq War until he supported the Iraq War. At least those who hadn't been paying attention to his position on the Balkans throughout the 90s, which actually did kind of predict his position on Iraq. But anyway, so yeah, I do just think that he was always very attuned to the currents on the right in Europe and the United States. And I remember him being really critical of the Tea Party movement, recognizing it as like proto-authoritarian. He saw a lot of sort of white identity politics at work there, and I think he would have seen that in Trump really early on, and would have recognized it for what it was. But again, I can't speak for the guy. It's just fun to think about. I make my case for why I think he would have diagnosed Trumpism in the book. So yeah, if your reader or if your listeners are interested, they can check it out.
Great. Yeah, so do check out the book. And also, Matt, what are you up to now?
I'm just writing a bunch. I have another piece coming out in Quillette pretty soon about liberalism and new theism. It's a big honker, like 6,500 words long. Yeah, I've got articles coming out and like the Bulwark and a bunch of other places. Just wrote a piece for Persuasion about like political Christianity and new theism. Oh, and it's got the heterodox word is actually in the title of the article. It's something like the Christian split or religious split in the heterodox community. So yeah, I'm just writing just endlessly.
Awesome.
I'll be
Awesome.
Yep.
Sounds great. And all topics that I do obsess over. So that's very good. I'll check them out.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, I think we have
Hey, thanks
similar
for coming on the
interests.
show today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.